To order. We're going to go out of order on your agenda today. We're going to start out with some of the legislative agencies first, and then we will go to the office of the governor last to give everyone the remaining time. We'll begin with Dylan on the Legislative Coordinating Council.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. So I know that some of these budgets have already been reviewed, so if you could turn to page 4 of the LCC budget before you. So looking at fiscal year 2024, there was an SGF reappropriation of $41,490. The pay plan shortfall is $6,535. And there was no further adjustments. This budget includes 8 FTE positions. Looking at fiscal year 2025, on page 6, the agency request is $771,397. It's a decrease of $62,203 or 7.5%, and that's due to decreased contractual services related to the constituent contact management system and a reduced estimate for salaries and wages of $51,544. It continues to request 8 FTE positions. With that, I would stand for questions on the LCC budget.
Questions of Dylan? Seeing none, we'll entertain a motion on 24 and 25 for the Legislative Coordinating Council. Make that motion. Motion made by Senator Alley, seconded by Senator Masterson. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Let's move next to the KLRD Legislative Research. Dylan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Turning to page 4, the budget analysis before you. There was an original appropriation of $5.2 million. There was an SGF reappropriation of $491,089. The agency estimate is $5.5 million with 41 FTE positions. It's a decrease of $188,931 or 3.3%, and it's attributable to the lapse of $226,493 in excess SGF funds. This budget does include the $37,562 for the pay plan shortfall, but the agency did recommend the lapse of the $226,493 in excess available funds from the reappropriation. Moving to FY 2025. On page 7, the agency is requesting $5.2 million and 41 FTE positions. It's a decrease of $341,629 or 6.2%. And the operating cost reductions are related to redistricting efforts and reduced funding for employee separations that are budgeted for fiscal year 2025. With that, I would stand for questions on the KLRD budget.
Questions, committee? Seeing none, we'll entertain a motion on the FY 2023 through 25 budget for KLRD. Motion made by Senator Alley, seconded by Senator Masterson. Any discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. We'll move now to the legislature budget. Dylan.
Certainly. Turning to page 5 of the budget analysis before you. This is the fiscal year 2024 analysis. There was originally $25.9 million appropriated for the legislature. There was an addition of $8.4 million of reappropriated SGF dollars. So the agency is requesting $33.3 million SGF in 24. It's a decrease of $1 million at 3% below the 24 approved budget. That is related to the lapse of excess SGF funds. About $348,000 of that lapse is in the operations of the legislature, and about $721,000 of that lapse is related to KLOIS lapse. There is $40,765 that is part of the pay plan shortfall, creating a $33.3 million agency request and governor's recommendation. There's a little bit of detail in here on the 24 legislative compensation. It still has the original compensation levels with the per diem analysis. Moving to page 8 for the fiscal year 2025 analysis. The agency is requesting $25.4 million. It's a decrease of $7.9 million or 23.6% below the 24 revised estimate. That decrease is attributable to reduction in contractual services, largely related to the KLIS modernization project. Phase 1. It's partially offset by the addition of $3.1 million to implement the Legislative Compensation Commission proposal The legislature built that in because it becomes law unless the legislature adopts a resolution that it will not become law. So it is built into the budget. The 25 legislative compensation would then have the annual salary set at $43,000 per year. There is a large $10.8 million reduction in contractual services in this budget. It's largely related to KLIS modernization that was in FY 2024, but also just some reducing back towards the FY 23 actual expenditures. With that, I would stand for questions on the legislature's budget.
Questions, committee? Seeing none, we'll entertain a motion on the legislature's FY 24 and 25 budget. Moved by Senator Alley, seconded by Senator Masterson. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Let's move now to the Legislative Division of Post Audit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Turn to page 4. There was an original appropriation of $3.6 million. There was a reappropriation of $487,891 in SGF. The agency's revised estimate totals $3.5 million. It's a decrease of $576,297 or 14% below the 24 approved budget. So there's a pay plan shortfall amount in this budget of $23,591, and there's a reduction in expenditures or SGF lapse of $599,888. I would note that total lapse does exceed the total amount of the reappropriation. So moving to FY 2025. The agency is requesting $3.5 million SGF for 25. It's a decrease of $64,332 or 1.8%. And that decrease attributable to not budgeting $50,000 for outside contractors and consultants, and a reduction of about $14,000 related to fringe benefit costs. With that, I would stand for questions on the LPA budget.
Questions for Legislative Post Audit for Dylan? Seeing none, Chair will entertain a motion on the FY 24 and 25 budget for the Legislative Division of Post Audit. Moved by Senator Alley, seconded by Senator Pittman. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. We'll move now to the Reviser of Statutes. Moving
to the last legislative budget you will be hearing today. It is the Office of the Reviser of Statutes on page 4. So the legislative approved for fiscal year 2024 was $4.6 million. There was the addition of $870,322 for reappropriations, and it is a budget for 33.5 FTE positions. This budget does include $29,250 for the pay plan shortfall, and lapses a total of $870,322 in excess SGF monies appropriated to 24. Moving to the 25 budget on page 7. The agency is requesting $4.6 million SGF for 25. It's an increase of $200,429 or 4.4% above the 24 revised estimate. The increase is attributable to the agency budgeting for a 5% increase in salaries above the 24 estimate. It includes 33.5 FTE positions. With that, I would stand for questions on the reviser's budget.
Questions for Dylan? Senator Pittman.
This budget doesn't appear to have anything in terms of IT upgrades or anything from that point of view. Is that correct?
No, I don't see anything budgeted for IT upgrades in the system. There is some in the KLOD budget. We did budget for some database upgrades and stuff like that that we've been pursuing internally. But I don't see anything. I would defer to Gordon to see if there's any other items that I'm not aware of.
Thanks. Further questions? Seeing none, Chair will entertain a motion on the FY 24 and 25 budget for the Reviser of Statutes. Moved by Senator Alley, seconded by Senator Pittman. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Let's move on to the Office of the Governor. Draw your attention, there is quite a bit of written testimony on this particular budget. Will Lawrence is available here for questions should you have any, committee, and there will be some individuals who have requested to give oral testimony. We'll start out with Dylan giving us our analysis and move on to that testimony. Dylan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. There is quite a few representatives of both the agency and other groups that are here behind us that will be able to provide some additional detail on this budget, but I will go ahead and provide a brief overview. So if you were to look at page 4, I'll start with a little 10-year analysis. Okay, so you can see that the budget, the state general fund expenditures for the Office of the Governor tended to stay a little bit under $10 million and was stable between FY 2016 and FY 2022. In FY '23, the legislature approved an additional $20 million in one-time SGF expenditures for the Rural Housing Revolving Loan Program. And starting in '24, the legislature began funding the CASA program predominantly from the state general fund and eliminating special revenue funding in the judicial branch. So you see some other SGF funding that's coming in here. And I'll talk a little bit more about SGF funding on '24 and '25 because there's some changes there. So looking on page 5 of the budget before you, the original SGF approved for the Office of the Governor was $22.9, $23 million, and $49.2 million, all funds. There was an SGF reappropriation of $596,209, all right? And $420,000 of that was in the domestic violence prevention grants, and $58,794 was for child advocacy grants. The agency estimates a revised estimate of $57.3 million, including $23.5 million SGF and 63.3 FTE positions. This is an increase of $7.5 million from all funds, or 15%, including a decrease of $60,235 SGF, or 0.3%, below the approved budget. And the agency's revised estimate includes an increase of $3.4 million from federal ARPA funds for LSSE grants, and the addition of $4.1 million for adjustments to various other federal grants. So you can see in '24, the majority of these are not SGF adjustments to the previously approved budget. These are really different federal grants. And I would remind the committee that the federal fiscal year and the state fiscal year are not the same. So as a result, some of the timing for these grants they're not aware of when we're originally hearing those budgets. The biggest sort of substantive change is related to these LSSE grants, which you could see some additional detail on page 6 for. And so these LSE grants provide funding to local units of government for the purpose of improving the accessibility and efficiency of the delivery of services to Kansans through investments to modernize IT technology, continuation of operations, and then safety and security. And the LSSE grant also allows for the replacement of wildland firefighting equipment. The '24 budget does allow for 0.5 FTE positions in order to be able to operate this program. With that, I would stand for questions on '24.
Questions on 2024, Committee for Dylan? Seeing none, we'll move to 25.
All right, moving to FY 2025 on page 9. The agency is requesting $50.7 million, including $23.1 million SGF for '25. The request is a decrease of $6.6 million, or 11.5%, and an SGF decrease of $358,445, or 1.5%, below the '24 revised estimate. The SGF decrease is attributable to the lack of reappropriations, so that's $596,209, and it's offset by increases in the administration program, $118,584, with $162,262 for salary and wage adjustments due to the elimination of some shrinkage, and the remaining SGF is related to budgeted reappropriations. There are some executive branch agencies that actually carry their reappropriations from the current year into the out year. This is one of the examples of those. So there's a deletion of $5.3 million for crimes victims assistance grants. There's a deletion of $700,000 in ARPA funds for total expenditures of $7.6 million. And this is ARPA, sort of operational costs that are associated with the Office of Recovery, as the Office of Recovery is anticipating a winding down of operations. There is a deletion of $227,565 in the Improving Criminal Justice Responses grants. No funding is budgeted for this program starting in this budget year, so that's the end of that program. And in all other adjustments I've sort of talked about, those are those budgeted reappropriations and shrink adjustments that I've discussed. Turning to page 10, there are some governor's adjustments to the governor's recommendation. So the governor recommends $58.3 million, including $30.7 million SGF for fiscal year 2025. It's an increase of $7.6 million, or 32.8%, all from the SGF above the 25 request. And the governor is recommending $5.9 million SGF for domestic violence prevention grants, $1.1 million SGF for Child Advocacy Center grants, and $634,000 SGF for the Court-Appointed Special Advocate, or CASA program. The domestic violence prevention grants and the Child Advocacy Center grants have been indicated that they are there because of reductions in federal funding for those programs, and this would offset that reduction in federal funding. The CASA grants is simply an increase of that particular program. With that, I would stand for questions on 24. I would note there's quite a bit of additional detail, particularly on the federal funds, starting on page 17, which is the program analysis of the Federal Grants Office. And so for the majority, or as far as more, all of the federal grants that are managed by that office, you'll have a little one-paragraph blurb that gives you some background on what that particular federal grant is for. I would stand for questions on any particular grant, but honestly, the grants office is present in the office here, and they're probably a better person to ask.
Questions for Dylan, Senator Pittman?
Thank you for the rundown, Dylan. Really appreciate it. I'm particularly interested in the VOCA grant fund. We talked a lot about it last year. We had some propositions. We had a lot of compelling testimony as we came out of the pandemic about some of the rising needs there. I don't see where inside of the budget, the supplemental and the enhancement requests, where do we see that particular line item in here? I see.
So you're not going to see it as a line item. You will see it on page 18. And so in the bottom of page 18, in the bottom left-hand corner, the VOCA Victim Crime Assistance Grants, it is buried inside of their budget, but since there's not an adjustment being recommended by the agency or anything like that, it doesn't really stand out.
Right now, it's at somewhere around 3 points.
I'll get you the number as soon as I sit down at my desk and pull the
I
spreadsheet.
appreciate that.
Further questions? Senator Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I noticed in there it wasn't part of the agency request. So what's the timing? Or maybe that's a question for Will when he comes up as far as timing.
Whatever you prefer.
But is this set, I can't see historically back. I know we're transplanting federal dollars to SGF for federal dollars. Historically, are we setting kind of a new normal with SGF, or are we just kind of returning because we had originally transplanted federals in there?
There's been a varies. If you're talking about funding for some of the domestic violence prevention and child advocacy center grants, it is a new high for SGF funding. There's also, it's an increased focus on SGF. There's been some other sources of funding that have gone into those in the past. So I can provide you a historical background on those if you would like. Maybe 10 years, will that work for you? All right.
Further questions for Dylan? Senator Pittman.
So on that, I think what we're looking for, is this right? We're looking to see how the federal funding and the state funding have gone into these programs and how much we've given, right, in terms of relative amounts over that 10-year time period from both.
I have a chart for that.
I bet you do. All right.
All right.
Further questions? Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Office of Recovery, as it rolls down, will there be some FTE that will roll down also?
I imagine there will be at some point. There's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of outstanding ARPA fund dollars that are committed, okay, and so they've been sort of approved for certain programs, but they have not gone out the door. So there is still a lot of work to be done to verify that we are in compliance with the federal laws on those. So there's some reduced expenditures that are associated with it there, but there is still quite a bit of work to be done until those ARPA fund dollars do hit their expiration date.
Thank you.
Senator Pittman.
On that VOCA report, when you read that out, can we also understand how many federal dollars, whether we're under the amount that we could be getting for that in terms of matching dollars? I don't know if I'm saying that right, but if there's an opportunity to draw down more money from the feds, I'd like to understand that as well.
Certainly, I will look into that with additional detail. My understanding is that is not a matching fund in the same way that some of these other ones are, but I will verify that and get back with you.
Any further questions, Committee for Dylan? Seeing none, Dylan, thank you. Before we move into oral testimony, I want to remind those who are giving testimony that we do have your written testimony in front of you. We would prefer you not read to us the testimony, but instead give us the highlights of what you are presenting in your written testimony. We will start with Michelle McCormick, the Executive Director of the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. I am Michelle McCormick, the Executive Director for the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. And you do have my written testimony with some extensive background information about why we're here today. So I will hit the highlights. I am the Executive Director of the membership organization. ks.gov is the membership organization for the 25 agencies around our state that provide direct victim services. And so I'm here speaking to their needs today. As you know, our agencies provide critical services around the state of Kansas, and one of the other conferees can speak directly to the service provision. But we're talking about emergency shelter, 24/7 hotline calls that are being answered. The advocates are providing support to victims and survivors when they go to the hospital in order to get care. And we operate 24/7, 365 days a year. So the services are critical. We are here today and requesting your help and your support because the demand for our services are going up at the same time that the federal investment in our programming is going down. And so that is a tough combination of factors. And so you have a lot of background information that I've put in my written testimony about what was happening at the federal level with regard to VOCA, the legislative efforts to try to fix VOCA, and how the funding, the receipts just haven't caught up with the need. And so I want you to know that we are also advocating at that level and requesting our federal delegation try to help us fix this problem as well. But we're at a point where we are really asking for your help. And so I will tell you that I am asking for some additional funding, which is a departure from what you'll see in the governor's budget. And to remind you, last year, we were able to demonstrate to the legislature that if our programs, if their budgets were forecasted in order to meet all the unmet needs, then the need would be well over $12 million, which is what we asked for. We asked for $10 million last year in enhancements to help us meet the unmet needs, not only the shortfall from the VOCA funds. We asked for $10 million. We were very grateful that the legislature gave us $5 million in enhancements on top of the additional funding to fix sort of the shortfall from VOCA. And so we were very grateful for that. But we are asking for the additional $5 million on top of what you'll see in the governor's budget for the domestic violence and sexual assault agencies. I can tell you that we just looked at our numbers this morning to make sure we had some updated information. And in 2023, there were 3,000 Kansans who weren't able to be served because our programs were at capacity. So they were asking for services. They weren't able to be served in the way they were asking for because our programs were at capacity. If the shortfall isn't addressed, that number, of course, skyrockets. And you can see some of our programs are able to forecast that. For example, our Hutchinson program said that if the VOCA cuts aren't addressed, that would be in their service area 300 Kansans in addition to those who are already unmet, who wouldn't be served. In Johnson County, they're forecasting over 1,000 victims and survivors who wouldn't be able to be served because they'd have to reduce capacity. And so this is critical. This is critical, what we ask of you. And I know that it's difficult, given a lot of folks are asking for your support. But I would just close by saying, it's not an overstatement to say that these services are life-saving. And so, and I'm obviously representing the domestic violence and sexual assault agencies, but please know we have a lot of allied professionals in the room. And our services are intersecting. And so I also am supportive of their requests for additional support because we all collaborate and work together. But certainly our need is critical. And I thank you for your support last year deeply, but also we're requesting support again this year. So.
Questions from Michelle Committee? Senator Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned it was short on capacity. So is your capacity shortfall, is that driven by personnel or providers or facilities? I mean, is there?
Yeah, it could be a combination of the three. So the member programs track when someone, let's say they call in for shelter, but the shelter is full. They have to make that really difficult decision about, do they ask someone to leave the shelter, or do they just say to somebody, let me help you find another alternative? Sometimes they have alternatives, like they can, if they have enough funding, they could potentially put someone in a hotel for a night or get them transportation to another program that may have capacity. They will try all of those maneuvers, and still sometimes there aren't enough resources to serve someone.
Because it's predominantly facility-based. You'll hit capacity at a facility.
Sometimes it is. I know that sometimes we have member programs who maybe have a larger facility, but because they don't have staffing resources, they have to operate at a diminished capacity than maybe what their facility would allow. But mostly it's because the facilities they only have a certain amount of capacity.
Further questions? Senator Howley.
Where are your facilities located?
We have 25 programs all around the state of Kansas, and our website will show you how those service areas are broken up so that all counties are served in Kansas. But I can give you an example. Our program in Hayes is the shelter facilities located in Hayes, but they serve 18 counties in north central and northwest Kansas. There are several facilities in Wichita, but they are spread around the state.
Further questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
We'll move now to Amanda Myers, the Executive Director of the Wichita Family Crisis Center. Welcome to committee.
Good morning. I'm Amanda Myers. I'm the Executive Director of the Wichita Family Crisis Center. So I appreciate not having to reread all my testimony. I'll just say I am a provider. I'm a director of an agency of a shelter. We offer 24/7 shelter crisis services, but in addition to shelter, we offer a myriad of services, and I'm not going to list them all. But the idea is that in addition to shelter, it takes a village, let's say, to keep a family safe and help them rebuild their lives so they're not returning and returning and returning. We want them back in society, leading productive, independent lives. And to that end, we not only need funding for services, but we need funding for staffing in addition to that. So we have been a longstanding member of the Wichita community for 115 years. We're very good at what we do, and we've been doing it for a long time, but we also serve Cowley and Sumner counties. So we are the biggest agency in South Central Kansas. I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of what the financial burden is that we're seeing right now. And I'm happy to explain the VOCA SGF situation as we see it. I've been doing this for a little while now, so I battle funding like pretty much every year. Not only the amount, but getting access to it is a struggle for each of us. So far this year, and I'm talking since July 1st, because that's our fiscal year, we've seen an increase of 62% in hotline calls. We are a 24/7 hotline. That includes a lethality hotline. So the Wichita Police Department has a direct line to our shelter if someone's life is in danger. And domestic violence homicides were at a record this year in Wichita. So not only are the numbers increasing, but the severity of the issues that we're seeing have increased. We've already expended our food budget for the year. So we are asking the public to help us with our food. We're struggling to get staffing because we can't compare to, a Quick Trip or something like that in terms of wages. And inflation has just really hit us hard. Utilities are expensive. We increased our shelter capacity by 60% in the past year. We still struggle to serve everyone that comes. And it's something that keeps me up at night, not having to turn people away from our shelter. So you will not find a group of directors, the 25 agencies that Michelle was talking about, my 24 counterparts, we all do all the work. On Monday, I drove 4 kids to school in our beat-up minivan because of the ice. So we all do all the work, and we do it with a joyous heart, but it's hard. When sometimes we think it shouldn't be this hard to do this work. The current funding levels being proposed, the small increase that the governor proposed is just not enough, the $3.6 million. We are asking for an additional $5 million SGF funds. That will get us much closer to where we need to be to keep people alive. And the only thing I'll say before I finish and open up for questions is please prioritize organizations that are serving the most vulnerable among us, women and children, and keeping them alive. Shelter, food, hygiene products, clothing. We can't get to the next level of services, whatever that happens to be, if we don't provide the most basic level of services. So with that, I will just open it up to questions. There's obviously more detail in my testimony. Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda. Questions, committee, Senator Pittman.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do. It's well needed. I'm going to ask a question just as a devil's advocate, all right?
Go for it.
All right. So we have the Kansas Coalition that has 25 facilities across the state.
Right.
We are state legislature, and this is the Wichita Family Crisis Center.
We're part of the same ask. So we're part of them. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yes. All the same ask.
I didn't know if each facility is asking for $5 million.
No. Yeah, I'd love 5 million, please. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's actually, no, I'm asking for 5 million across all 25. Yeah, as part of the ask. I'm just here to provide the details, an actual provider.
If there was a
But seriously, 5 million is fine. Go for it.
If there was a funding for homeless shelters, would some of that, like if we have some money that's for homeless, I'm not sure how that's going to be spent. It's a proposal right now inside of a budget. Would any of that make its way to a place like yours potentially?
It potentially would. Domestic violence victims are considered homeless per HUD. So assuming that the money was designated and did, include quote unquote HUD definitions, some of it could come to us. It's complicated by community.
Last question is, does your kind of facility, and I'm not picking on Wichita, it could be Johnson County, do they also get some city funding or county funding?
We do not. We have tried to get county funding. We do not get county funding. And the only city funding we get is through HUD. So we do not get city funding.
About that?
Yeah, and trust me, I've asked. I mean, I don't care where the money comes from, quite frankly, as long as I get it. But yeah, it's a bit frustrating.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Masterson.
Thank you, man. Partially asked and answered. I was going to ask the city, county, but do you have philanthropy or charity, or do you have other revenue sources besides?
Absolutely. As you know, our community is incredibly generous. And that is what's kept us afloat, quite frankly, is private philanthropy, private foundations, private donors. The increased capacity that we were able to get, we raised $7.5 million, mostly privately, for a new shelter. But the Victims of Crime Act and SGF funding is also really, really important to what we do because it's about the safety and security of our community.
Does that look to remain strong, the local?
I hope so. I think so. I mean, inflation hits everyone. Right. So we do hear impacts from our direct donors and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Further questions? Senator Alley.
Thank you for being here. I noticed that you have Cali and Sumner counties also. Where are and how many shelters do you have in those two counties?
So we have one shelter, and that shelter is in Wichita. We have outreach offices in Winfield and Wellington. So if someone needs shelter, we bring them into Wichita. Yeah.
Transport them back?
We do, with that little beat-up minivan I was talking about.
Any further questions of Amanda? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll move now to Mike Burgess with the Disability Rights Center of Kansas. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as he said, I'm Mike Burgess, and I'm the Director of Policy and Outreach at the Disability Rights Center of Kansas. My goal is to be some of the briefest testimony that you have today. The previous conferees did a great job. We are here supporting their ask. They do wonderful work, and our agency partners with other entities that do serve crime victims. So again, we're just here to support that, and I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Questions for Mike? Brief it is. Thank
All
you,
right,
Mike.
thank you.
We'll move to ks.gov, the Children's Advocacy Centers of Kansas.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I am Casey Dahlke, Executive Director for Children's Advocacy Centers of Kansas. We are the state chapter organization that provides support, mentorship, technical assistance, and statewide leadership to all of our child advocacy centers across the state. Currently, we have 17 CACs, as we call them, organizations statewide, with an additional 12 satellite locations where some of those original organizations have expanded to meet the needs of other communities, as well as 6 mobile units, which are pretty unique to our state. Those mobile units are able to provide services specifically in the more rural counties of Kansas. Our CACs operate off of a multidisciplinary team response, and our core MDT partners per statute are law enforcement, Department for Children and Families, mental health professionals, medical professionals, as well as CAC forensic interview and advocates as well. We also partner with other victim service agencies, as you are meeting today, some of those in this room as well. Those partnerships are critical and important for our services. In 2023, our CACs provided 8,546 services to 4,400 children across the state of Kansas. The kids that we are serving are primarily sexually abused, physical abuse, emotional abuse, witness to violence, witness to domestic violence, homicide attempts, drug endangerment children, as well as child sex trafficking. As we know, last year the federal budget, VOCA, cut our centers 40%. And we are incredibly grateful for the state filling that void for us. Without that support, we would have closed organizations. Certainly, our satellite locations would have closed. When we're talking about these federal dollars, these are the funds that support our direct service workers. So those are the front lines, our therapists, our forensic interviewers, our advocates, important work being funded by those dollars. And it's not lost on me that I'm here again this year. We're facing another 45% cut from our federal funding. And again, what that means for us is closure of organizations, loss of staff, and ultimately loss of services to children and families in Kansas. You're going to see on my written testimony, I've got a couple of graphics in there on the back 2 pages. It's going to give you a breakdown of the services that we provided this last year. It's also going to give you a look at what that would look like with the 40% or 45% cut this year. And we would have to turn child abuse victims and their families away for services with those cuts. So I encourage you to look at that. We are also actively working on a national level to advocate federally to Congress about where we are at with VOCA, the impact that this creates for our organizations. Our federal partnerships with National Children's Alliance is actively working to come up with ideas to help fill that void federally. And then there's a state leader organizations, state leaders such as myself, the other victim service programs here in all 50 states, also advocating federally to make sure that our voices are heard and that they understand the critical need here. The importance of our work serving child abuse victims, yes, number one. Also, we are able to provide that coordination for child abuse cases, strengthening the investigations that DCF and law enforcement provide, which then in turn strengthen the cases that are provided to prosecution for hopeful successful prosecution and better outcomes to the judicial process. I like to mention the research that CDC cites on the lifelong impact of child abuse. The research is my last page of testimony. You can look into that just a bit further, but it cites that children who have experienced one or more ACEs scores, adverse childhood experiences, abuse, are much more likely to encounter long-term, lifelong effects, risks, complications. What that looks like is obesity, substance use, heart disease, cancers, increased suicidal attempts, and successful suicides. And what I will say, CDC cites economically as well that the cost of the lifelong impact around $210,000 per individual who has experienced abuse as a child. And I'm not here to say that CACs can fix that 100%. What I am here to say is that child advocacy centers provide those crucial services initially to help plug these people into other victim service agencies, the support that they need to that way they can hopefully begin their healing journey and suffer less of those lifelong impacts that I just described. I'm going to wrap up my testimony today and give you just a brief snapshot of the past. Our funding was originated in 2008. I was not in these rooms speaking to these audiences at that time. I was just getting entered into my direct service work at the front lines. What I will say is $1 million was put in the SGF funding for child advocacy centers. It's my understanding there were plans and opportunities for growth there. It's also my understanding that the very next year, that $1 million was cut down to somewhere in the $800,000 range for all of our organizations to split, and has remained static within that $800,000 up until this past 2023 cycle where we asked for assistance from the federal loss. When that funding was originated, our CACs were serving 1,753 kids. Present day, we're at 4,400. And so I ask for your support in the 1.1 recommended from governor's budget to add to the CAC line item. But I also want to inform you that when we run the numbers of awards given, SGF funds and VOCA dollars to all of our organizations, my organization ran the numbers from 2022 to 2024 and did a projection into 25. The 1.1 million asked by Governor Kelly will still leave us in a 3.84% deficit. And with that being said, I also just want to remind everyone that static funding for us is a cut in funding. Our ask for services goes up, but our funding has continued to remain the same. So in addition, I respectfully ask for an additional $2 million on top of the recommended $1.1 million from Governor Kelly for a total of $3.1 million for child advocacy centers in the SGF budget. This will help us grow our organizations and serve the population. 31% of Kansans do not have equitable access to a child advocacy center as we stand right now. Therapy services are minimal. The types of therapy services that are needed for children who have experienced abuse are unique. There's a national study out there on trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy that is crucial. Not every community has access to those therapy services, and with this increase of funding, we would be able to provide those services to all the kids that we serve. With that, I will stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Questions, Senator Pittman.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I know personally in Leavenworth, we've seen this be very successful, and it's critical services, these child advocacy centers. I just want to express my disgust at the federal government right now. Cutting this type of funding and not providing a roadmap for how we're supposed to deal with these most vulnerable populations is egregious. And obviously, it's getting pushed back onto the states without a lot of communication about a path forward. And here we are where we're at. So I'm personally disgusted by that, and I appreciate you here advocating for these centers.
Thank you, sir.
Further questions for Casey? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move now to Matt Keenan, the Executive Director of Kansas Legal Services. Welcome to committee.
Good morning. Joining with me today is TK Shively from Kansas Legal Services, and I only have about 3 minutes, so I'll try to move quickly. Kansas Legal Services is a nonprofit law firm with 11 offices across the state. We have about 42 lawyers, and we essentially help the lawyers with their non-criminal matters. And last year, we helped about 20,000 Kansans across the state. In a time of shrinking lawyers across the state, Kansas Legal Services has attorneys handling matters in all 105 counties in the state. We have an office in Wichita, we have an office in Salina, Pittsburgh, Manhattan. We're everywhere, essentially. And one of the big things that we do is help victims of crime. So we're very strongly supporting the governor's grant program budget. Victims of crime need lawyers, whether the victims of crime are victims of elderly abuse, identity theft, or domestic violence. The role we play is supplemental to the important role you've heard from all the speakers here this morning. We have the lawyers in the court to help untangle the legal challenges these men and these women and sometimes men face. We have last year 2,800 clients that we helped in Kansas under the VOCA funding. You can go into a number of counties across the state, and we are present there for the domestic violence docket. On Thursdays, for example, so today in Wichita, there's a full day dedicated to domestic violence docket, and the Kansas legal attorneys are the only attorneys there representing the victims. So I just have a few other points, and then I'll conclude. When it comes to representing victims of domestic violence, the private bar wants nothing to do with those cases. They're highly emotional. The victims typically don't have any money, and there's a component of danger in those cases. KLS attorneys step in that void and take the mantle and represent those victims. And that's an important role that's only made available because of the funding we get from the governor's grant program. There's two other points, then I'll sit down. An important role the KLS attorneys play is to determine whether or not claims have merit. Today, about 75% of protection orders are filed pro se without an attorney. The cases that do have an attorney are cases that KLS is typically involved in. KLS is ethically required to only take cases that they deem have merit. And that is an important safeguard that we bring to the system. You talk to judges in your county, you talk to your county administrators, and you're going to see that the role of KLS attorneys at the protection from abuse docket brings sanity, brings order, brings efficiency, and brings fairness, and brings justice. Those attorneys are there because we get the funding from VOCA. The final thing I wish to say is we have been in touch with Senators Marshall and Senators Moran on this issue. I went to law school with Jerry Moran, and Roger Marshall is from my hometown, and they support Kansas Legal Services in this mission. The issue of VOCA and VOCA funding is a complicated matrix, but I certainly think it's worth greater transparency from the government about where that money is and what we see coming down the pipe. So ultimately, at the end of the day, what KLS attorneys do is a constituent issue. We help the constituents in your district, and with this VOCA funding, we'll continue to do that. Thank you.
Questions for Matt? Senator Pittman.
Just a thought, it's random, but thank you for your testimony, Mr. Keenan. We have a bunch of lawyers that make a lot of money in the state, and they are not willing to pick up where we have a lot of victims here. It seems to me that we could we could share that burden somehow. There's a lot of money out there where they get paid hundreds and hundreds of dollars an hour, and it seems like there could be something where, for that privilege of doing that in our state, some of that money could go towards Kansas Legal Services.
No question. And we did double the private fundraising this year. We raised $250,000 from essentially the private bar you're talking about. And one of the initiatives has been greater assistance with domestic violence, but there's no question fundraising. A lot of those attorneys I have relationships with, and I've been traveling all over the state, but yes, they have a ways to go. And they're ethically obligated to take pro bono matters as part of the practice. So I appreciate the thought, yes.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you. We'll move now to Caitlin Eakin, the State Director of CASA. Welcome to committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee. Thank you for having me. I'm Caitlin Aiken. I serve as the State Director for the Kansas CASA Association. We are the member agency for the Kansas CASA Network. It is comprised of 20 local organizations across Kansas that recruit, screen, train, and supervise court-appointed special advocates, or CASAs. CASA volunteers are assigned by a child in need of care judge.
Caitlin, I'm going to interrupt you. We're asking that you not read your testimony. If you'd just like to hit the highlights, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sorry. We, at the conclusion of 2022, we served around 1,374 children with 646 CASA volunteers. And so with that, we know that we're not serving enough of the children in need of care in Kansas. Only 22% of the children that are in foster care right now. And so we are asking for your guys', the legislators' continued support to key functions of our goals to safeguard the provision of services to current and new children seeking CASA volunteers. Your support of the 2025 governor's budget will do two primary functions. safeguard the provision of services to 100 to 150 more children in the Kansas foster care system needing a voice, support, and guidance from a trusted adult, and afford security to services of roughly 1,000 children receiving current advocacy from our 13 CASA programs who are facing critical shortfalls in federal funding. With that, I just wanted to hit a couple highlights of why CASA is so important to children in foster care. One, a CASA volunteer only serves 1 to 3 children at a time. This narrows the focus, providing better long-term outcomes. They're not re-entering care, they're graduating high school, and they're remaining in safe, loving homes. We have a 96% rate for submitting court reports on time. We have a 5-year average of 98.2% success rate for child stability with their CASA, meaning their CASA isn't changing year to year. And in 2022, our CASA advocates provided 53,427 contacts to the children they serve and pertinent people to that case. And so those are the reasons that we're asking for legislative's continued support. Thank you.
Great. Questions for Caitlin? Seeing none? Thank you.
Thank you.
That wraps up our oral testimony. Just a reminder, committee, that Will Lawrence is available if you have any questions of him at this time. Questions for Will? Senator Masterson. Will, would you stand for a question? Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just the earlier one, why wasn't it in the original agency request? What was going on behind that?
Good morning, Subcommittee, Mr. Chairman. So what I do is I put together the initial budget that then goes through the process. And so because in this particular area, we've had the continued, shortfall from the federal government, I leave that for the governor to assess in her decision week with those numbers. And so that's been kind of the process. And I was kind of getting some information from last year because we had this very similar conversation last year where the governor put in the numbers to make up the shortfall, but there was no enhancement. In this subcommittee, you asked me to go back to the governor and discuss if there'd be a GBA for consideration, and we did come back with, and the governor submitted a GBA at the end of session for, I think it was 8.4 million, and the legislature approved 5. So that 5 million that was approved was, an enhancement that is still in there. And so then what the governor has done is looked at the shortfall from the feds and then has put in SGF to cover that as well. So that's where things are at right now, as I understand it.
So do you have conversations with the feds? Because I'm going to echo Senator Pittman. It's very disappointing in an age that we're spending incredible amounts of federal dollars that this would be an area that you would see. I just don't understand. I can't wrap my mind around it, with the trillions of dollars that were flying out there, and then this is what we're seeing. But do you have conversations then with the federal administration, since there's some connection there? Is that?
If you're referring to the president, we have not had many conversations with the president on this issue. It is one that is frustrating to us as well. We have these ongoing conversations, and you and the governor share a similar view on special ed, and the fact that, the feds have not been doing their fair part on that as well. And so these are issues the governor has been focused on, and, we have opportunities to raise these concerns. We do. For this purpose, we're trying to figure out how to balance those shortfalls with putting the SGF in, but also, how much more do you put in? That becomes kind of an open question and a challenge to try to figure out. Obviously, these are really important services that are being provided, and I don't think anyone disagrees with that. It's trying to figure out how to make all of this work, and a budget that I always try to keep from growing too much, because I always get questioned when I come up here if there's any changes in the numbers. So,
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions for Will? Seeing none. Thank you, Will. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll entertain a motion at this stage for the FY 24 to 25 budget for the Office of the Governor. Senator Masterson. Senator Masterson moving approval at the governor's recommendation for 24-25, seconded by Senator Alley. Discussion. Senator Pittman.
Mr. Chairman, I would love to consider an additional ask without having the money or numbers in front of me. I'm going to wait to make that motion until we get to the overall Ways and Means Committee. I'd like to consider putting an additional $4 or $5 million in for the VOCA funding at this time, but I want to see some of the numbers from Dalen first.
Perhaps we could just add to the Office of the Governor's recommendation that Ways and Means review those specific asks that were made today in this committee.
Absolutely.
At the committee hearing on the governor's budget.
Yep.
Any objection there? Seeing none, we'll just have that added in to the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. At this time, we are adjourned.